Hi, and welcome to our presentation today, 50 years later, a look back at the fight over the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment in Grand Rapids. Today, we have two presenters, myself, Nora Salas. I am the director of the Cucci Office of Local History here at Grand Valley State University. And joining us, we have Ruth Stevens from the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. So to begin, we thought it would be good to talk a little bit about just the history of the Equal Rights Amendment. Our focus is to look at the local debate, but to talk first about what is the Equal Rights Amendment in the first place. A little bit of a brief explanation. The Equal Rights Amendment, and you see the text here on the screen, the story of this really begins just after women successfully concluded their struggle for a constitutional amendment securing voting rights. After the 19th Amendment passed, one of the key groups involved, the National Women's Party, decided that the vote alone would not be enough to create what national suffrage leader Alice Paul described as equality of the sexes. So the idea here is that one of the groups involved in the suffrage struggle thought the vote alone, it's not going to do it. We need to go farther and further secure women's rights. And they thought that it would take a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the equality of the sexes and banning sex discrimination. So Paul and others wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, as we see here on the slide. And the critical part of the Equal Rights Amendment is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Right. And then the other parts have to do with how the amendment would be put in place, the process. Paul successfully got the ERA introduced in Congress in 1923, and it was introduced in every session between 1923 and 1972, but really made little progress over those decades. From the beginning, the ERA was controversial, and controversial among women reformers, among people who had been involved in the suffrage struggle. And it was controversial in the 1920s, primarily because of what was called women's protective legislation. Most of the former suffrage campaigners initially opposed the ERA because it would have overturned women's protective labor laws. So women's protective legislation was a set of laws that required minimum wages, fewer working hours, better working conditions, sometimes limited how much women could be required to carry, or women working at night. These laws were passed beginning in the 19th century to protect women, and some women did indeed benefit from them, but they also promoted a view of women as less capable and enshrined sex discrimination in the law. Right. So in the law, there were provisions to treat people differently because they were women, right, which had repercussions for other areas of legislation and interpretation of courts. Many unions and women's organizations opposed the ERA in the 4 decades between its introduction and the late 1960s. For example, in October 1945, John Reed, then Secretary-Treasurer of the Michigan Federation of Labor, spoke before a meeting of labor union women in Grand Rapids against the ERA. He was supported in this position at that meeting by Ann M. Kleiner of the Grand Rapids League of Women Voters. Support for the ERA grew over the time period of the women's liberation movement beginning in the 1960s. And the National Organization for Women became the major driver of the ERA in 1968. During the early 1970s, the winds shifted, and all the most powerful women's and labor groups changed their positions and became supporters of the ERA. This included the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, the AFL-CIO, the UAW, the Teachers Union, and other groups. So now I want to go on and talk about the process, what happens in the 1970s to try to bring the ERA the closest it ever came to passing. Right. In 1970, Michigan Congresswoman Martha Griffiths obtained enough signatures from fellow lawmakers to get the ERA out of the House Judiciary Committee. Griffiths pressed her fellow lawmakers for their support, and she said, quote, "Give us a chance to show you that those so-called protective laws to aid women, however well-intentioned originally, have become in fact restraints which keep wife, abandoned wife, and widow alike from supporting her family." You know, and in this quotation from Griffiths, we can kind of see a lot of the argument about the Equal Rights Amendment at the time, and how that promoters were aware that past generations had, and even some of the same people who are still around in the 70s from the struggles in the 40s and 50s had been opposed to the ERA, but over time this changed, and this is part of why Griffiths was successful in getting this legislation out of committee. So hearings began on the ERA in 1970, and it passed the House in 1971 and the Senate on March 22nd, 1972. And these were not close votes. The ERA passed overwhelmingly in both houses. In order to become an amendment to the Constitution, 2/3 of the houses of Congress have to agree, which we see that they did when it passed. And this happened in 1972. And then time limit was put into the legislation that they had 7 years to complete ratification by the states. So to become an amendment to the Constitution after it passed through both houses of Congress, it had to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that meant 38 states out of 50. Initially, support for the Equal Rights Amendment was very broad, and 22 of the 38 states ratified in the first year. And we can see on this map of where the situation lay in 1982. The states that ratified are the unshaded ones. Organized opposition really started and kicked off after that point, and the pace of ratification slowed. 8 states ratified in 1973, 3 in 1974, and 1 in 1975. And after that point, no additional states ratified the ERA in this period, the 70s, 80s time period, and some states rescinded their ratification or sort of voted back against their ratification, as shown on this map. The deadline was then extended through June 30th, 1982, but ultimately the ERA fell short by 3 states and was not adopted into the Constitution. So next I want to talk about some of that support and opposition. So, as we can kind of tell from the strong amount of states that ratified the ERA, especially in their first few years, there was broad support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Despite the fact that it was ultimately defeated by those opposed to it, this didn't mean that that meant that support for the ERA was declining over this time period. Support was also bipartisan. Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter all were in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. Locally, a broad range of moderate Republican women, including Betty Ford, joined Democratic women leaders such as Martha Griffiths in endorsing and campaigning for the ERA. The bipartisan organization ERA America was a major force behind the ratification efforts and was actually co-chaired by Michigan Republican Ellie Peterson and Texas Democrat Liz Carpenter. So I wanted to talk briefly about the reasoning for those who supported versus those who opposed. The reasoning of supporters was primarily about an ideal of women's equality and the very practical problem of women trying to make a living. So supporters were especially concerned about stopping legal discrimination in housing, credit, insurance, as well as unequal pay. And they joined with these concerns abstract belief in the equality of the sexes, in the equality of men and women, as they would have seen it at the time. And one of the main things they wanted to have happen was a different type of constitutional protection for women. So they wanted to make women a protected class. And a protected class and women's protective legislation are different approaches. And it's a little confusing because they contain a lot of the same words. Protected class has a very specific legal meaning that's different from women's protective legislation. Women's protective legislation sought to protect women by treating them differently, okay, by requiring a higher minimum wage for women versus men, or by requiring limiting the hours women could work versus men. Making women a protected class, which is what the ERA sought to do, would protect women by making the act of treating women differently very difficult to enshrine in the law. So if you wanted to treat women differently, then you have to, it's not impossible legally, but there's a very high bar, the highest possible bar. So next I want to go on and talk about the opposition. So, and we know that the opposition was strong and strong enough at this point to defeat the ERA. So even while the ERA enjoyed broad support, there were those who continued to oppose it. In 1972, a well-known right-wing author and conservative activist named Phyllis Schlafly founded a group called Stop ERA. Through this group, Schlafly organized a successful national campaign to prevent state legislatures from ratifying the ERA and convince some states to rescind their ratification or to take back their approval of the ERA. Schlafly and others' opposition to the ERA at this time was rooted in their belief that men and women were created fundamentally and immutably different by God, and that any legal attempt to treat them the same would fail and destabilize society in the process. Opponents predicted a number of what they thought of as destructive catastrophes that would occur if the ERA was passed, including women being subject to the military draft, mothers would have to work and children would be in government-run daycare, increased rights for gay and lesbian couples, mixed-sex bathrooms, access to abortion, women would have to pay child support, benefits for widowers after the death of a spouse in addition to benefits for widows. And we can see, you know, some of their reasons why they were opposed in these photos from national anti-ERA protests. In addition, ERA opponents often argued that women had special privileges as wives and mothers that would be destroyed if the ERA passed. And in fact, Schlafly was known for saying that the STOP part of the ERA stood for stop taking our privileges. This was the setting and struggle in which Michigan and Grand Rapids residents entered when they fought for and against the ERA. Now we are very fortunate to have Ruth Stevens from the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council to discuss how this struggle played out locally.
Thank you very much, Nora. This is really a fitting time to be looking back at the fight over the ERA because in 2022, we have the 50th anniversary of when it was passed by Congress, and in 2023, the 100th anniversary of when it was first passed or first introduced by into Congress. And I'm going to focus, as Nora said, on what was going on here in Michigan and locally in Grand Rapids. As Nora mentioned, the ERA was sent to the states for ratification in March 1972, and Michigan ratified very, very quickly. The ERA really soared through the House, and it was approved just a couple of days later by the Michigan Senate. There was definitely opposition, but there was a lot of support. So it passed quickly, but it wasn't for lack of opposition. It's just that more people were in favor of it. And one thing I want to note is that Republican women made a point of writing a letter to the press later talking about the Republican Women's Club in Grand Rapids of Kent County, of noting their support and how they had made that known to the legislature. Now was an important driving force in Michigan for both the ratification of the ERA and then the later efforts to garner support for the ERA. And it's important to keep in mind that NOW had been working on feminist issues since its founding in 1966, and the local chapter had been working on other issues. So NOW certainly wasn't a single issue organization, but they had the resources, or that they were developing, and to actually put together committees and a real organized fight in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. Locally, we had the beginnings of a National Organization for Women chapter in the early 70s, and it became formally chartered by NOW in 1974. The first president was Kathleen Downs Lewis, who became very influential in the support of the ERA in the Grand Rapids area. She was a leader in the fight for the ERA. She served on a statewide NOW committee that helped provide supporting materials for the activists. And she brought that home and was involved in a lot of different capacities. The other group that was formed in Michigan that was influential was the Michigan chapter of ERA America. And I'd like to stress, as Nora did, that this was a bipartisan effort, and the effort to support the ERA in Michigan and locally was very much bipartisan. So in the picture at the left, you'll see the ERA America co-chairs, Democrat Liz Carpenter from Texas, and Republican Allie Peterson on the far right, with Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford, both of whom were strong supporters of the ERA. At the local level, ERA America became the coordinating group for the efforts to ratify the ERA. Kathy Downs Lewis was active in writing letters to the editor, either to respond to an anti-ERA letter and just to try to spread accurate information about the ERA. And that was one of the main efforts of the group, was to make sure that they got the word across and that people got accurate information about the ERA. The local ERA America became an umbrella that had over 20 different local organizations involved. And some of the other organizations that worked very closely in this local effort were the League of Women Voters, the Coalition of Labor Union, which itself, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, which itself was formed in the 1970s, the YWCA, the Junior League, the Negro Business and Professional Women's Club, and the sorority Delta Sigma Theta. So we had a broad coalition of women's groups working together under the umbrella of our local ERA America chapter. On the other side, Michigan formed its own chapter of Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA group, and that was led by Elaine Donnelly, who was from the Detroit area. Elaine also did some work later for the for the National Eagle Forum. This is an example of one of their brochures. Stop ERA, as the name suggests, was a single issue group. It was simply about the ERA. And one of the early anti-ERA efforts at the state level was to get the state to rescind its ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. This was a national strategy. This was going on in other states, and as Nora's chart showed, it was successful in some states. In Michigan, The House committee considering this rescission bill rejected it and would not bring it to the floor. And this provoked a very, very angry outburst among the anti-ERA group. And there were 20 women who disrupted the proceedings at the House and, you know, made threats, which must have been shocking at the time, but sound more like some of the discourse that we have in politics today. It's unclear what the legal effect of rescission would be, but at the time, I don't think it was really known. Now I think it's pretty well understood that would not have had any legal effect, but this threat of rescission did loom over ERA supporters in other states. It's something that they had to contend with, and they didn't know if it would be brought up again. Also on the anti-ERA side was the Michigan chapter of Phyllis Schlafly's Michigan Eagle Forum, which was led by our local resident, Betty Van Andel. And of course, this was a very well-resourced organization. The Eagle Forum had a much broader agenda than just being against the ERA. It had a pretty broad anti-feminist agenda. And in their efforts to fight the ERA, they had less of a public face. And for instance, I was not able to see a record of Betty Van Andel speaking at public rallies, but there's a lot of the record shows that she would speak to church groups and other private groups. And that's really the way she got the message out. And I'm sure she was a very effective and popular speaker. As this battle progressed, one of the important types of strategies by the pro-ERA group was to hold public rallies. And this was done annually on Women's Equality Day, which is August 26th each year. And Women's Equality Day had been proclaimed at the national level in 1973. And it was a very significant date for feminists because it was Equality Day was proclaimed to honor the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So it is very significant, and it's still celebrated today by many different women's organizations, including the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. So this is one of the early Equality Day rallies. This one, and at this one, Jean McKee, a prominent Democrat who was the first woman to serve on the Wayne State Board of Governors and who also ran against Gerald Ford for Congress. She spoke to the group gathered here at the Calder Plaza. And this tradition then continued, and there were a variety of different speakers, but we can see that the local group was very good at recruiting state and national level speakers to Grand Rapids. In 1976, at Union High School, the ERA America brought in national level people. Dorothy Hayner was a prominent labor activist, and also with her was Michigan Republican State Rep Ruth McNamee. One of the challenges that the ERA supporters had was, or one of the arguments used against the ERA, was that it was anti-family, anti-housewife, trying to destroy the family. And you can see from the sign on the wall at Union High that the ERA supporters were trying to counter that narrative. You know, we support ERA and still bake apple pies. So they were really responding to that and trying to show that this wasn't an all-out assault on women's roles. And there probably were not a lot of ERA opponents in the audience to see the sign, but it was an important message that they wanted to get out. And in 1977, ER America was successful in getting national co-chair of ER America, Ellie Peterson, to speak at a rally, again, on the Calder Plaza in Grand Rapids. And Ellie Peterson had strong Michigan ties. She was the first woman chair of the Michigan Republican Party, and she was the assistant to chair of the National Republican Party. So she was a very important speaker. Behind her, you will see Kathleen Downs Lewis of the local chapter. At these rallies, they were often a family affair, and you'll see the separate photo of Steve Moorhead, who is the son of a local NOW leader, with a sign saying, "My sisters deserve the same chance as I do." So the rallies brought out whole families to hear this message. And on the other side, as we move into the second half of the 70s, and we're getting now towards the initial expiration of the ratification deadline, we're seeing not only the activity by the pro-ERA supporters, but also by the anti group. And the local Eagle Forum brought in Phyllis Schlafly, who really the architect of the whole anti-ERA movement at the national level, to speak at Calvin College. And she filled the Calvin College auditorium. It was a very successful event. There was a private reception afterwards at the Amway Corporation, to which state senators were invited. So it clearly was both, an event, for the attendees at the Fine Arts Center, but also an attempt to, influence the political climate in Michigan. There were ERA supporters outside, and one brave supporter, Sue Peterson, ran through the auditorium with her sign, but that was not welcomed, and so her sign was ripped away from her, and the meeting just went on. And Phyllis Schlafly basically gave her standard stump speech that I think Nora has covered a lot of her arguments. The pro group also was successful in convincing the Grand Rapids City Commission to vote 4-3 to boycott states that had not ratified the ERA. This was in 1978. And this meant that the city would not fund any travel to states that had not yet ratified the ERA. This particular vote was very controversial. It triggered a number of letters to the press, and the Grand Rapids press was supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, but did not support this strategy at all. There was something about the idea of boycotting. People saw it as being coercive, and so it was controversial. In 1979, or as in the lead up to 1979, the Equal Rights Amendment supporters were really under pressure because the ratification deadline was looming. The progress in getting states to ratify had really stalled, and there was a major march in Washington in support of the ERA, with the goal of demonstrating the widespread public support, but also it was paired with a lobbying event where marchers stayed over in Washington after the march and then lobbied their representatives and their senators in support of a bill extending the time for ratifying the ERA. So you'll see on the right, Helen Milliken, who was at the rally with West Michigan Congressman Harold Sawyer, and she went in to speak with him. Sawyer was on a key committee, the House Judiciary Committee, that was considering the extension, and he was really wavering on whether to support it. He gave various reasons for that. But and in the end, he did support sending the bill out, extending the ERA, and it was extended. But his support was less than zealous, I would say. He was very wavering. And then another major event that occurred that was shocking to many, and especially to more liberal women in the Republican Party, like Helen Milliken, Ellie Peterson, and I'm sure to many local Republicans. In 1980, at the Republican convention held in Detroit, the party broke with its decades-long support for the Equal Rights Amendment and adopted a neutral stance where it just it recognized efforts of both the pro and anti groups. This was very controversial and really, was the beginning of a break of sorts within the Republican Party. Here you can see Republican nominee Ronald Reagan at the Calder Plaza at a rally. And you can see that it's crowded with his supporters. And of course, he had a lot of support in Grand Rapids. But there are a few ERA supporters who've made it to squeeze into the crowd with ERA yes signs and pro-ERA signs. But obviously, for the mass of people gathering on the Calder Plaza, he did not support the ERA, and his lack of support for the ERA was not a cause for supporting the Democrat. He was enormously popular here, regardless of his support for the ERA. And after he was nominated, Congressman Sawyer basically said he didn't see the Equal Rights Amendment as a major national issue, that there were other issues that were much more important. Unfortunately for the ERA supporters, the ratification deadline did expire on June 30th at 1982. And this image shows supporters gathering at the Calder Plaza the day after to talk about next steps, and kind of really what they were trying to do is demonstrate that they weren't down and out, they weren't defeated, that the work would go on. And at this rally, we had speeches from prominent local community members and politicians. John Adebaker, state representative, spoke. Mary Alice Williams, city commissioner. Ellis Sims, a community leader. And also Kathleen Downs Lewis read a telegram that was sent to the supporters from Betty Ford, which said, "The work has not ended, and we are not going home like good little girls. We are rededicating and rejoining and starting again. We are taking our next step forward." And that was really the spirit of this gathering, was move on, regroup, keep fighting. The anti-ERA supporters were, of course, rejoicing, and they had seen this coming for a long time because of the lack of new states ratifying the ERA. But of course, they were very pleased with the result. And as we look back on the struggle over the ERA, I think with this time interval now of 50 years, we can reflect on really what it meant and how it was significant. The ERA never did pass, it never became law. And so, does this matter? Does this fight over the ERA matter? The Grand Rapids Press did an article shortly after the deadline expired and interviewed women who had been on both sides of the struggle over the ERA. And I'd like to share a couple of quotes from the women who are shown here, Kathleen Downs Lewis on the left, and Jane Cordy of the Eagle Forum. The Kathleen Downs Lewis said, when asked, what she had learned from the fight, I see now that women can make a difference. Jane Cordy shared, if women don't get involved, who is going to do it? So what we see coming out of this fight was women getting involved and becoming politically active, because indeed it was a political fight over the ERA. And we could see this carrying forward in terms of women's involvement in politics. Shortly or during this period, a local chapter of the Michigan Women's Political Caucus was formed, a group encouraging women to run for political office, and a bipartisan group. So clearly this got women out there and active. And we can see then in the decades after how women made significant gains in terms of especially political elective office. I see this somewhat as a starting point for all of that. And I know Nora has some comments too, as we reflect on this. And so I'm going to turn the mic back to her.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And I think that Ruth really leads into some of my concluding comments about what the significance of this struggle nationally in Grand Rapids in Michigan is. The debates over the ERA in Grand Rapids and across the nation clearly show that women had the power to shape the course of the nation, to engage in a long-term campaign that came extremely close to amending the Constitution of the United States. But they also had the power to stop this change. It is clear that the ERA would never have been ratified by 35 states or stopped in the other 15 without the involvement of organized, informed, outspoken, and politically involved women. And I labeled this slide conclusion ? Because the debate over the ERA and women's role and the meaning of women's rights, whether it be in 1972 or 2022, still has the power to remake the political landscape. And even though the original deadline for the ratification of the ERA passed in 1982, there is still an ongoing campaign about the Equal Rights Amendments. Some continue to argue that the ERA is no longer viable because this deadline passed, but advocates disagree, and in recent years, they have worked to revive the ERA. In 2020, the 38th state, Virginia, shown on this map in the purple, ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And then in 2021, the House of Representatives voted to remove the deadline for ratification of the ERA. And that's sort of where the situation stands today. There are a number of court cases proceeding both against and for the ERA, and for its ability to still be ratified in our present. And in addition to these 3 states in purple that have ratified the ERA, there are other states like North Dakota that have in the last 4 to 5 years revoked their ratification, because those who are opposed to the ERA also see this as a sort of live debate that's occurring in our present. It is unclear how the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court will rule on this matter, but it is evident that the ERA is a part of our past, our present, and efforts to pass it will continue to be a part of our future. Thank you.